Ever since I was a kid flicking through the pages of rulebooks, White Dwarf and the battle games in Middle-earth magazines, I have dreamed of building my very own gaming table. There's just something so immersive about playing out a game on a textured, realistic table that you just don't get from playing on gaming mats or your kitchen table, and seeing some masters such as Luke from Geek Gaming and Lockie from Zorpsup regularly building some incredible tables has really made me want to scratch that itch. Now, theme tables are really cool, however, for me there are definitely some drawbacks. First of all, they're pretty one-dimensional. Once you've played out a couple of games on them, you get to know the layouts and games can get somewhat repetitive. Secondly, boards with loads of mountains, hills or ruins look great, but what the hell do you do with it when you're not using it? I simply don't have the space to have a board kept out permanently. For my board, I want to tackle both of these problems, while still making it interesting and fun to play on. Oh yeah, and I'm going to be making it double-sided for twice the fun. I'm Benji, and welcome to Benji's Hobbies. I picked up my timber for the board and frame from my local DIY store. The board itself will be made out of MDF, which I got cut to size at the store for me, otherwise there is no way I would have got the entire 8-foot board in the car. I used some batten around the edges to create a frame within which I'll be building my layout. The reason for this will become apparent a little later on, but personally I think it's a nice feature to have an edge on boards, as it stops errant dice from rolling off the edge and inevitably going missing on the floor. I probably went a little bit overboard here and both glued and screwed these in place, but this just means that these will be really solid and going nowhere. It probably wasn't particularly needed either, but I spent a little time sanding the battens to remove a little bit of the roughness and very gently round off the edges. It just makes it that little bit nicer to handle and gives it a slightly nicer finish. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of building the boards, let me tell you a little bit about this video's sponsor. Now, even though my YouTube channel has been up and running for over 2 years, I still feel some serious imposter syndrome. But one thing that definitely makes me look and feel more legit is having my own dedicated website hosted by the dudes over at Squarespace. Squarespace make it so easy to set up a professional looking website in just a few clicks. Their templates are effortless to use and totally customizable to my needs, so I can make a website that is personal to me and that I can be really proud of. One of my favourite features is being able to embed videos in my site, so you can check out my most recent YouTube videos direct from my website rather than having to search for them through YouTube. And what's more, I can check out a ton of analytics and get some insight into how much traffic my site is getting, all from just a few clicks. So if you want to look like a totally legit YouTuber just like me, then go and set up a Squarespace website today. And by using my link, which you'll find down in the description below, you'll save a chunky 10% off your first website or domain purchase. I mean, what's not to love? Right, back to the board building. For the first and simplest side of the board, I want to create a flagstone texture that could be used to recreate a paved city, a long forgotten dungeon, or ruined fortress. Now, I could have carved flagstones myself, however the thought of carving and texturing 16 square feet of stonework fills me with some serious existential dread. So instead I sort of cheated by using these textured XPS tiles from Fire Dragon Games, which are perfect for covering large areas like this. Now, the beauty of these is that they come pre-textured, so if you're short of time like me, or just plain lazy, you can get a really cool look on your boards with minimal effort. I stuck these down with a solvent-free grip adhesive, which creates a really solid bond between the MDF and the XPS tiles. With the adhesive dry and the XPS tiles firmly glued in place, I masked off the edges of the board. Whilst this isn't totally necessary, I feel like I could end up ruining the look of the wooden edges if I don't protect them at this stage. I want the board to be durable and long lasting, so to help strengthen and toughen up the foam, I'm going to coat it in a mix of Mod Podge and black paint, and once this was fully dried, I painted it completely with a mid-grey craft paint. Now this is the really fun part of painting this board, and essentially rather than painting individual flagstones, I'm going to follow a technique I've seen Lockie from Zorpazorp use, and I'm going to use some light grey and off-white spray cans from the Colour Forge to add some variation to the currently grey board. The aim here isn't for areas of solid colour, it's more to just dust the surface with paint and create areas of high contrast. Now these will look really stark and really bright right now, but adding a black wash mix consisting of water, black ink and a little rinse aid will help tie it all back together and really knock back those bright areas. With the wash dry, this side is looking pretty good, and for only a few hours work, I'm really pleased with the result. This is incredibly simple, but I think it looks pretty effective. Make sure you stick around till the end of the video to see this side of the board in action. With the board flipped over, it's time to start on side number 2, and this one will be a little bit more interesting and intricate, and obviously take a little bit more effort than the first. I'm starting by using some MDF sealer, again by Colour Forge, to cover the exposed MDF board. I'll be using some paint and other liquids directly on the MDF on this side, so I want to make sure that it's protected to prevent it from swelling and warping, and at worst falling apart. Once this is dry, I cut up some rough foam shapes to create some hills and gentle undulations. I'm really not overthinking this and just gluing down hills with a hot glue gun where I think they look good, but I'm also leaving plenty of open space and flat areas for scatter terrain. The only thing I'm making sure of is not to build up the hills any higher than the edges of my board. It'll become apparent why later on in the video. Happy with my hillage, I'm going to glue on some orchid bark chips to some areas of the hills to create some rocky looking outcrops. Some of the bigger pieces I'm sawing in half with a hobby saw to make the bag of bark go a little bit further, and to create outcrops that match the scale of my board and hills, rather than looking too big and out of place. I'm going to blend it all in using some Geek Gaming modelling compound to smooth the edges of the hills and around the outcrops. This makes them look a little bit more natural rather than looking like bits of bark glued to foam. Now my advice when using modelling compound is to mix smaller batches and work with small amounts at a time. If you mix too big a batch, you'll find that it starts to go off before you've had a chance to use it. And also don't go using your mum's best measuring jug for mixing it either, because you will end up with bits of plaster stuck to the inside. Before it fully dries, I'm using small amounts of water to work it in and smooth out any rough areas, and help blend in the outcrops, and to give you more gentle and gradual undulations over the hills. With this dry, I can start painting the board. I'm painting the orchid bark outcrops with Payne's Grey before adding in small amounts of grey, followed by an off-white, and gradually dry brushing layers on, making sure to leave the darker grey in the recesses and just catching the edges with the very lightest tone. This will all be covered over later, but I like to paint the base entirely so that if there are any patches that don't get covered with ground texture, they don't stand out drastically and detract from the look of the board. With the outcrops painted, I add the main ground cover, and for this I'm just using brown grout. I mixed up some PVA and water to give me a thin glue mix, and then painted this over the large areas of the board, followed by the grout, which I scattered on through a sieve. The sieve helps even out the layers of grout rather than piling it up, but even if you apply a little too much, it's not really a problem, as I'll be locking everything in place in a later step anyway. Once the board is entirely covered and the glue is dry, I sprinkled down some base ready mix in patches across the board to give it a little bit more variation and texture. In particular, I focused this around areas around the base of the outcrops, but in all honesty, it looks pretty good when sprinkled in random patches across the board anyway. Next is the static grassing. I've used my static grass applicator a few times now and love the effect that it gives compared to just using flocks. To glue it down, I'm using fast drying basing glue, which is spread thin across an area of the board with an old brush. You're definitely going to want to use a disposable or old brush for this step, because I don't think there's any way of saving them once they've been through this. You'll also notice that the glue is in places picking up the grout, but again, this won't be a problem once everything is sealed down. Providing there's a sticky surface for the grass to stick to, it'll be all good. I started off with 2mm grass across big patches of the board. It's tempting to cover the entire board, but I think it pays off to be more selective. It's nice seeing variation on the coverage, from lush green pastures to worn and trodden muddy looking paths. It definitely makes it look a little bit more interesting than an entirely green board. Once this was dry, I used some static grass layering spray and used this to glue down some longer 4mm static grass. Again, this helps add a little contrast and variety to the board, rather than it ending up looking like a well-manicured golf course or Teletubby land. The key here is definitely to be more selective and just add the longer static grass in patches rather than across the entire board again. Once this is dry and I'm happy with my layers of static grass, it's time to seal everything down in place with some matte scenic sealant. Now this stuff is brilliant for locking not only the static grass in place, but also the layers of grout and base ready underneath. Before applying the scenic sealant, I'm dosing the board liberally in isopropyl alcohol, which will reduce the water tension and help the sealant soak into the board to give it that final solid finish. Once this is dry, it leaves the board really solid and durable for gaming on. Finally, I added a few tufts to add a bit of further vegetation, and with that, the board is ready to play on. The great thing about these boards is they're textured enough to feel immersive, while still being plain and open enough to add different scatter terrain to keep them interesting. These lovely Road-inspired buildings, for example, were built by my pal Michael from Nat1 Videos, and I just love how they set the board off. I've included a link down below if you want to go and check out his channel and to see how he made them. The same can be said of the other side of the board too. Some simple 3D printed columns turn these flagstones into the Dwarad Elf in Moria, which will definitely make for an exciting board to play on. I honestly can't wait to get some games in on these. The last thing to do is finish the storage solution for this double-sided board. I wanted to make a cover for the board to protect it from damage, so I used the other half of the sheet of MDF I bought to create a sort of lid for the box. Again, I sprayed on the MDF sealer before using a couple of coats of emulsion to give it a white finish. To secure the new lid on the box, I'm using these small spring clips which will make it easy to remove and reattach it as and when necessary. And finally, I screwed some heavy-duty picture hangers on the back to hang it on the wall, and like that, I'm able to mount my new board securely and safely on the wall without it taking up any space, with the boards fully protected. To hide the board a little better, and to help make it look less like a box stuck to the wall, I bought some prints from an artist called Bo Preston, who I have long been a fan of. He creates some stunning Middle-earth and Star Wars inspired drawings, which I have long admired on his Instagram. I framed the prints and attached them to the board using some command strips, and like that, rather than looking like an odd box on the wall, it looks like the start of a Middle-earth themed gallery wall. Whilst I only have 3 frames up at the moment, I know I'm going to be adding some more Middle-earth inspired artwork soon, but for now I'm happy to admire the prints I've got up. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it's inspired you to build your own super simple and easy to store wargaming board. I'd love to see your attempts at this, so if you ever make one, make sure you share it over in the Benji's Hobbies Facebook group. Finally, make sure you go and check out Squarespace for all your website needs, and be sure to use my link for an extra 10% off when purchasing a website or domain. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys very soon in the next video.